like, oh man, I think this is crazy. I think we have something here. And that's when I really truly believed that, at least for the short and midterm, that's something that will help us accelerate forward.
Hey guys, before we start today's episode, please note that none of our statements in this video represent financial advice. You all know that, but investing in cryptocurrencies is risky.
Hello and welcome, DeFITIMES community, to yet another episode of DeFITIMES Daily. Today, Fabian and I have the pleasure to welcome Jay Kurahashi to the show. He is the Vice President of Marketing at Avalabs. Hey Jay, how are you doing? It's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Really excited to dive into some of the things that have been happening the last few weeks. I know you guys have been keeping track, so ready to get into it.
Indeed. I think this will be an awesome episode. And before we dive deeper into Avalanche, it would be super cool if you could give us like a short introduction to yourself. So how did you enter the crypto industry, and what is your background, and what are you working on right now?
Yeah, so the way I got into it was probably like a lot of the early Bitcoin people, just totally by accident in early 2011. That was kind of when I had no idea what any of this technology was. So just had to get my feet wet. And not until the Ethereum white paper came out did I really start taking things seriously, because I was like, how does this internet money actually function? Does it have a place in society? Really couldn't understand the philosophical implications of that. And when Ethereum came in and Vitalik was really evangelizing this kind of world distributed computer, that's kind of the simple way he was putting it, I started to say, okay, I still don't know what that really means, but to me, it seems a little bit more interesting than peer-to-peer payments. And especially because I don't have a traditional finance background. And so Ethereum comes in, and meanwhile, I'm already professionally involved in marketing, mostly for traditional financial services companies. One of the biggest ones was American Express, and a credit card company or payments company. And from there, slowly in like 2016, 2017, people, especially the large corporations, were saying blockchain. And I was kind of one of, a handful of people at the ad agency I was working at called Ogilvy, who knew about crypto and blockchain, at least to a adequate level. And I think you just started getting thrown in pitches. I realized that I was looking around and saying, okay, I think this is actually a really good strength to lean into. I happen to be nerdy enough to probably waste my weekends reading all these white papers. Why not actually try and figure out how to make it into a profession? And that's when I started a marketing consultancy group at Ogilvy for a few years with a few colleagues of mine. That's where we started engaging with brands. One of the biggest brands we engaged with was Circle. So Circle's still around today. And then from there, I was like, well, I like this stuff. I get to rotate through a lot of these projects, but I really want to be in the thick of the action, really understand how these crypto startups, organizations are maneuvering the landscape. And so jumped over to a firm called Fluidity, primarily was focused on decentralized exchange called AirSwap, but also focused on security tokens. I'll say that we were definitely early, but I think we learned a lot from the security token side, something that I wouldn't have necessarily gotten exposure to had I not been at Fluidity. Incredible team. Those guys are actually at Consensus now, some of them, and they're part of the MetaMask team right now. And then last year, after the acquisition went through with Consensus, joined Avalabs, where I was leading marketing here, grew the team to where it's at now. So was about the 20th employee. Now we're at 100, I think 120, something like that. And Avalanche, I think, is kind of the bread and butter of Avalabs. And so you probably haven't heard of Avalanche too much in the last year. We've only been around since September 2020. But as things started to heat up a little bit, I'm sure crypto Twitter definitely has been vocal the last few weeks. And so that's I think where we're at today. And what we're working on now is really to grow out the DeFi ecosystem first and foremost. I think that's something that's really important for the users that are listening, but also not to forget all the other segments. NFTs randomly got very big this year. I think NFTs, we all know, it's been existing for years and years, or not years and years, but since 2017 era. When ERC 721s are implemented, but now it's when it's kind of broken to the mainstream. A lot of people are talking about it, good or bad, we don't really know yet. And then enterprises, of course, I think is the last piece. Enterprises are still kind of laying low. They're not quite sure how to leverage this technology, especially on the permissionless side, because no one wants to upload all of their private IP onto a public blockchain. It just doesn't make sense in today's world. So I think those are kind of the pillars we're touching right now. There's obviously more, but I think those are the important ones, and that's where we're at now.
Yeah, and as you said, like things are starting to heat up in the Avalanche ecosystem, especially in the last 1 or 2 weeks after you announced the Avalanche Rush. Like everyone was talking about Avalanche suddenly overnight, and my Twitter feed was full of Avalanche content, and we really want to dig deep into it, like in this podcast. And to start things off, could you give us a quick like overview of the Avalanche blockchain? How does it work? So, and especially how does it compare? In which like way does it differentiate to or like differ to Ethereum? How Ethereum works?
Yeah. So I think the biggest difference is transaction finality or settlement. That happens in usually under 1 second. I don't quite know what the finality is these days on Ethereum, but you guys obviously know this. With high gas costs, it depends on how much you're willing to basically pay the toll. If you want to have the low requirement, it's going to take a little bit longer to get it processed. If you pay a lot of money, of course, you could probably get it through pretty quickly, but you're probably spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars denominated in US. So finality is super strong. And that's because of the consensus protocol. And the consensus protocol is totally different from Nakamoto and classical consensus models. It basically uses probabilistic measures to make sure that you basically are able to scale up consensus as rapidly as possible, basically with the idea that things will likely be favorable or not, or I guess like valid or not valid. You basically pick one side. And that's kind of like the high level overview. For people that are listening, there's a fantastic video done by one of our founders, Emin Gunsir. He does a million times better job than I can ever do when it comes to the actual technical overview. So that actually is something that I would recommend watching. But effectively, you have this new consensus model, which is providing at Avalanche that advantage. And on the smart contract side, that also is important because then the smart contracts can scale pretty well as well. And right now we're doing pretty well with smart contracts. There's always room to improve. So the developers are focused on making sure that we can scale as the demand scales. And the other thing that I'll highlight is transaction fees. I know there are other chains out there that are also kind of playing that game, just to try and make sure that it's a little bit more reasonable than perhaps Ethereum or other more expensive smart contracts chains. So when you want to process transactions on Avalanche, dynamic fees actually just launched. So it's dynamic based on load. And usually the transaction fees are a few dollars max, probably way less. And if you're not on smart contracts and you just want to do payments, they're a fraction of a cent. So very low.
Yeah, awesome. And this is very attractive for many projects, because we just experienced it in DeFi summer 2020, because all of a sudden gas fees exploded and the demand for DeFi services was so high. And that said, many people weren't in the position to pay that much money for a simple Uniswap transaction, and that really kicked off the scalability debate. But besides, Fabian just mentioned this point already, the Avalanche Rush, and yeah, it was a very present topic in the past days. However, there may be some listeners and viewers who haven't heard about the Avalanche Rush yet. That said, could you explain in simple words what the Avalanche Rush is all about?
Yeah, Avalanche Rush, simply put, is an incentive program to attract more traders, users to come and try out the applications on Avalanche. That's the kind of the simple way to put it. There's up to $180 million in incentives. So that's probably what got a lot of people to kind of turn their heads and really stop to think about, okay, maybe I should get in on this. And maybe the last part for perhaps the more hardcore DeFi users, it's a liquidity mining program. The way I explain that, for those that don't know the term liquidity mining, if you're providing liquidity or using some of these protocols, you're going to get extra incentives in addition to some of like the protocol fees. That's all it is. So for traditional finance people, I tend to find it's kind of like a kickback, more or less. And for the next, let's see, looking at the calendar, for the next few weeks or so, we're trying to round out who's a part of this program, which protocols want to provide incentives. A lot of the really big ones, especially Aave, Curve, Sushi, they have matched a lot of our incentives. So it's really this multi-chain effort that we're seeing. I know that I guess those three projects specifically, they started Ethereum native. I know that they're also branching out to other chains, Polygon. I think there are a few others that maybe Phantom, I actually don't know, like BSC probably. They're realizing, yeah, Ethereum's great, but there's also all these other chains that are doing incredible things. And let's try and branch these out. But it's really cool to see that with Avalanche, the co-founders are saying, hey, we want to try this, but we also want to double down, and we want to also really be a part of this cool new endeavor. And so once the kind of whole family of Avalanche Rush apps are announced, then it comes to deployments, and it should be within a few weeks to a month max of where we're going to see these deployments come live and the incentives go live just like that. And that's when really the action, I think, should start happening.
Yeah, exactly. And as you mentioned, Aave launched as an Ethereum native app, basically. But then they started to launch on other chains like Polygon, for example, and they're also going to deploy on Arbitrum, which is an L2 solution. But they are also launching on other layer one chains like Avalanche. And it makes sense for me, because why would they only sit on top of Ethereum when there are whole other communities and ecosystems and a lot of capital somewhere else? So it just makes sense. And it's kind of like a natural movement that we're just seeing right now. But you mentioned that there are $180 million in incentive programs, like in the Avalanche Rush program. My question is, when will all of this be distributed? So is there kind of like a rollout phase, or is this like, are there several stages, or is it all at once?
Yeah, it should not. Yeah, so it's not really rigid in terms of like there are going to be phases when the incentives unlock, but it'll be case by case based on the protocol or the app, the DApp. So like Benki is an Avalanche native lending and borrowing DApp. They have $3 million in incentives. That's already live because the app deployed. Once Aave, Curve, and Sushi, and the other ones that aren't announced yet start deploying, let's pick Aave, for example. When Aave unlocks, I can't remember off the top of my head how much is committed there, but the amount that is committed there will be live as well. And then that will run for a 3-month period. And that's when the team at Avalabs, the group that's basically architecting this endeavor, we're going to try and figure out, okay, is this going well? We want to be very, very careful with this because it is a lot of money at the end of the day. And we're not trying to necessarily just throw it all and see what happens. We're definitely being as calculated as possible. This endeavor has been in the planning stages probably since the spring. And obviously, you guys haven't really heard of it until it's out. So we're very, very strict on those policies. We just want to make sure that we're very careful with all of this. The pools that we pick to incentivize also is part of the strategy. And then also maybe there's other things that we could be doing that may or may not be related to Avalanche Rush. There could be airdrops, there could be other incentivization schemes, things like that.
Yeah, very interesting and totally understandable. And yeah, it was kind of hidden, the Avalanche Rush, until now. But now it's here, and you mentioned it already. It incentivized also protocols like Aave or Curve to launch an Avalanche as well. That said, can we look forward to other DeFi blue chips coming to Avalanche? Do you have any plans here?
Yeah, I think we can. Without naming names, we are in discussions with so many prior to Rush. And when Rush came, I think the DMs started really coming in even more aggressively. So if there are any co-founders with leading protocols listening, my DMs are open. I respond to all of them. We will process you guys one by one. And at the end of the day, it's a permissionless network. So it's not like you need us to deploy something. Of course, incentives are nice, but there's also deployments that can just happen And I think that's the beauty of, I guess, the kind of early signs of network effects really starting to take hold. And I think we're still very, very early in Avalanche. We're not even a year old yet, but there's so much already going on. And I think the thing that we were talking behind the scenes was the Ethereum virtual machine, the fact that that's running on Avalanche. So you basically have the EVM with Avalanche consensus providing as kind of the engine powering it all. That's really what's kind of incentivizing Ethereum-based folks, but also just general Web3 developers, I would say, to want to try Avalanche, because the Solidity still is the most used smart contracts language and likely will be that way for a reasonable amount of time in the future. And so until then, for us, it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. Let's just lean into those things. Maybe in some future, if Solidity has some sort of capacity, then it might require an effort, not just in one chain, but perhaps a whole consortium of people to come together and say, hey, this isn't working, but maybe there's another way that we could solve these issues. And that's what's really cool about just technology in general. I think it started all the way during the internet days. I'm too young to really know what the early days are like, but I do recall just from reading and things like that, that it was also fairly collaborative. But now with crypto and blockchain, we have the luxury of having the internet as the information layer. So you can just talk to people and really collaborate. Like the fact that we're on this podcast even is incredible. You guys are on the other side of the ocean and we're still able to talk about things that we're all very passionate about.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned like the EVM compatibility of Avalanche, and that makes it rather easy for apps to switch from Ethereum to Avalanche. It's very simple for them to deploy their code on Avalanche because it's just like copy paste. So it's not very difficult. But on the other hand, it's also some kind of complicated because you have to convince those people or those protocols in the first place that they are going to launch on Avalanche, especially if it's a new blockchain. So could you describe the process of working together with Aave and Curve and how you convinced those guys to launch on Avalanche and how long it took basically to get the announcement out?
Yeah. I think the main thing that we were seeing, and I actually posted a thread about this on Twitter, kind of very high level, but early parts of this year in 2021, we just set out and just started to venture out and talk to people, just being like, hey, would you be down? Would you be down to come over or try? And it's a hedge, and that's kind of how we were positioning it. And the thing that a lot of protocols were saying is like, well, there's no liquidity. And liquidity was always kind of this pain point. It's the chicken or the egg problem, right? Yeah. Early protocols have that issue. And so we were like, okay, fair enough. We're not trying to force you guys to come to a party that doesn't exist yet. So then we were trying to figure out the foundational layers. What can we get first? So let's figure out how to get stablecoins on ramp. Let's figure out how to streamline the on-ramp process from exchanges. Still is not actually terribly good. I think it's decent for international people, but not great for US-centric people. I think that's just kind of the narrative that goes on and on, just ignoring specific chains, just crypto as a whole. And once these coins started deploying, then you started to see people getting a little bit more excited. Then other stable coins were going to come on, and then other tokens were starting to come on. And then there were native projects that were going to try and bet early on Avalanche and saying, okay, well, maybe we could capitalize on this opportunity, because if we set our roots in, and if and when the actual rush comes into the chain, then we'll be ready. And so you had this very close group of native dApps that started to form, and there's an incredible ecosystem that's already forming, and that's really cool to see, because Ethereum also did it similarly in that fashion. Then you had these blue chip DeFi dApps that were all of a sudden, way before Rush, coming to us and saying, okay, now you have my attention, but not fully yet. And so I would say with projects like Aave and Curve, especially with Aave, we have really good relations with them. I think it also helps that a lot of our team isn't just brand new to crypto. We've been around the block for some time, have worked with Stani in prior engagements as well, previous to Avalabs. And so that cycle was more just like standard BD relationships. Let's talk about what we can do. Is deployment enough? Not quite. We did that with Sushi. We deployed it. And the UI, it wasn't really clear that Avalanche was integrated. So we were working towards, hey, Sushi, could you help us out? Just make it easy. Because the crypto, it's almost with crypto UI, it's still very much like you're in an airplane cockpit and you're not a pilot. You're not a professionally trained pilot. You look at all these buttons and you're like, what is actually going on? And so we were like, let's make it absolutely clear. And then from there, Luigi, he's a colleague of mine. He and Kevin Sekniki, he's also co-founder, and a bunch of the BD and marketing team, we came together and we were saying, okay, how can we really juicing this up? And that's when the incentivization program came together. And I think that's what really was like, all right, this is it, let's do it. And it's not really that complex, right? If there's a huge amount of money involved, then it's going to probably get almost everyone's attention.
Yeah, totally agree here. And thanks so much for sharing these insights here. I think that's very interesting also to get a better imagination of how things work behind the curtain. And as we can see, Avalanche is a very exciting ecosystem at the moment. We talked about your Rush program already, but apart from that, what can we look forward to, and what would be the unique selling proposition of Avalanche? So in plain words, what will make Avalanche special in the future compared to other ecosystems?
Yeah. So in that framing, bringing back the first answer from earlier in the episode, transaction finality. I think that's super, super important at low cost. So that's kind of the first point. And the main story I always tell is like, I used to use MetaMask for Ethereum-based protocols all the time, and I still do, but I used to use them much, much more. And it was Uniswap, the classic other AMMs, the forks and things like that, and also some of the other DeFi primitives like Compound, MakerDAOs, Oasis, things like that. And when you're used to putting in the gas, you go to ETH gas station or you figure out what the gas costs are, trying to minimize your cost basis for transaction fees, and it's still very high cost. And you just sit there and you see that wheel spinning, and you go to Etherscan, you kind of just wait around, and you might like go make some tea, and you come back and you're like, is it accepted? And you make some tea again, and you go back and it gets rejected, and you're like, all right, I have to submit this again. So that experience was kind of the V1 experience. And when Avalanche was deployed, we actually didn't have dApps yet for at least the first few months, probably even a little bit longer. And so couldn't even try the smart contract enabled applications. But when I used it, and you can use it with MetaMask by just configuring the RPCs and things like that. And then the transaction went through on a Pangolin, which is a native AMM, and it took 2-3 seconds, I think. And the fact that the API nodes that are behind MetaMask is actually what's slowing down the experience as opposed to the transaction finality, that was when I was like, oh man, I think this is crazy. I think we have something here. And that's when I really, truly believed that at least for the short and midterm, that's something that will help us accelerate forward. I think the second piece is subnets. Subnets is this capability where you can have the permissionless chain, which is Avalanche, the Avalanche platform. And then off of it, you could also have, let's pick enterprise institutions, for example. They can run a side chain effectively. It could be permissioned, but it also runs on Avalanche consensus and can use the nodes that are validating the primary network or the kind of the main platform. And so you basically now have a very, very, very useful use case for institutions to want to try blockchain, because in their current environment, they're just deploying private chains, which doesn't really do that much. It obviously streamlines internal processes, but you're not getting the benefits of a wider ecosystem. And then another thing you could do is Avalanche subnets can actually help scale other chains. So if you have other virtual machines running on, then you could basically have all these blockchains, payments, and smart contracts also kind of live on it. So one possible future also is this kind of blockchain of blockchains. I know that's kind of Cosmos's line. I know that's Polkadot's line. It's definitely something that everyone's trying to take on, because it's definitely a viable route to choose. I think it's still very early to really confidently speak on who's winning there. And I think, again, it's not going to be zero sum. So there's probably going to be multiple chains. And then the last thing I think is decentralization. And that doesn't really mean anything to anyone beyond the DeFi circle, I think, or the crypto circle. But to me, it means security. And what does decentralization actually mean to people? For certain chains, it means 20 nodes. To other chains, it means thousands and thousands of nodes. To Facebook, it means 100 nodes controlled by a lot of corporations. I don't think someone's right or wrong. It's just a matter of how can you convey that to people? If you say tens of thousands of nodes, is that better than 1,000? Most people will probably say yeah, because it's just more secure and the centralization risk is not there as much. So that's what Avalanche is really strong with right now, because the way to be a validator is so simple, and people can just come in. The current count of validators, all block producing, we're at about 1,000 right now.
Yeah, and I think like people in this space are kind of like they only see like black and white. So if they see a chain, and then it's either like decentralized or it's completely centralized. So people can't think that we kind of like, you know, it's they don't think it cannot be a mixture of it, you know, and it's kind of like something also part of the maximalism we see in crypto. But anyway, so you mentioned that like before the interview, you mentioned that Avalanche is today interoperable with Ethereum. And
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about that, and also about the decision why you decided to build this bridge, and yeah, how it's going to be adopted?
Yeah. So the main challenge before the bridge even came about was who's the biggest leader and who could we help alleviate here? And Ethereum is obviously the answer for probably anybody right now. They're just the biggest ecosystem, and that's kind of the main tactic there. So the bridge, we actually launched an initial bridge earlier in February. It was kind of, let's get something out there, and we learned a lot from it. It actually, the simple way to put it is we had smart contracts on both sides, Avalanche and Ethereum, and you had relayers, so it wasn't fully trustless, but you had relayers basically processing those transactions. We had 5 relayers and 3 had to vote on either side. And so if you can think about it, it's 3 contract calls on either side. On the Avalanche side, it wasn't too bad. But when it comes to the Ethereum side, especially when the network was congested, you're basically multiplying the gas fees that you were incurring by 3. And so to cross the bridge, it costs sometimes hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And no one cared that it was on Ethereum or Avalanche. They just said, well, we're not going to use this. It doesn't matter whose fault it is, I guess, if you want to put it that way. And so we went back to the drawing board and we were like, how can we make this better? And so we brought in this Intel's SGX chip. It's a hardware chip. And not to get into that detail, but basically we simplified the voting structure, and there's no voting structure really. There's just basically wardens that are monitoring the transaction just to make sure that things are functioning okay. Otherwise, when it comes to the transaction costs, it's super low, and you can use it on the domain bridge.avax.network. And what it does is you plug in MetaMask. Let's say you're on the Ethereum side and you want to transfer it to Avalanche. You don't have to use a new address. It just sends it back to your same address. So if you have the 0x address and you send funds, then all you have to do is switch to the Avalanche network and your funds are there. And it's pretty easy to use. We've seen really good feedback. There's some opportunities that we could obviously improve upon. That's just the case for everything. And when it comes to what's awesome about the bridge in the future is it's EVM compatible. So all of the EVM chains can get integrated into this bridge fairly quickly. And so it horizontally scales very rapidly. So of course we took on Ethereum, but in a near term future, I believe it's on the roadmap. I think it should be this year, if not early next year. You're going to see a lot more chains coming in. So as Avalabs as a team, we all obviously are creating Avalanche, the layer 1, but it seems like the bridge is also something that is very strong as a solution as well.
Yeah, very interesting. And as we can see, there are many things we can look forward to. And in that sense, what are good hop-off points to first get active in the Avalanche ecosystem? And secondly, what is a good hop-off point to learn more about Avalanche in general?
Yeah, so the ecosystem, let's see, I think we are currently updating this page, but I think a good resource is ecosystem.avax.network. That should have a up-to-date roll-up of all of the ecosystem applications. And that's actually going to progress into something more comprehensive in a near-term future. We have this vision where we want to make sure that everything is accessible at your fingertips. You don't have to think about, oh, well, where should I go for this? Should I go to DApp Radar to figure out how to interact with these dApps, or should I go to DeFi Pulse? It just should all be in one central location, so you don't have to think about it. You just see it. Kind of like the early days of I guess like the internet, where you didn't have search to tie it all together. You kind of just had to remember the domains and things like that. So I think that domain is very, very useful for ecosystem projects. And then, sorry, what was the second question?
Yeah, good hop off points to engage with the rest of your community, like some handles in your social media.
Yeah, so with the community, I think Twitter is a fantastic place. Avalanche AVAX at Avalanche AVAX. Also Telegram, same handle. Most of our socials have the Avalanche AVAX handle. And then if you're always interested in, or if you're interested in marketing community as it relates to blockchain, my handle is JAYKS17. I tweet somewhat interesting things sometimes.
Yeah, and you heard it here first, as always. And if you want to engage with Avalanche and with Jay, as always, all the links are in the description below. In that sense, Jay, it was such a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks so much for sharing all these interesting insights. And in that sense, I hope I see you soon.
Thanks. Appreciate it, guys.